You were always stupid and worthless. Mom just pities you for nothing," she laughed. Then they took her away at night in a straitjacket. And suddenly, everyone started calling me the only reliable one. Growing up in our house felt like living in a constant performance where I was always the understudy nobody wanted to see on stage. My sister was 3 years older and had this way of commanding every room she entered. She'd walk in and suddenly the air would shift, like everyone was holding their breath waiting to see what she'd do next. Me? I was the background noise, the kid who existed in the spaces between her achievements. She had this razor-sharp intelligence that could cut through any argument, any excuse, any hope I had of being noticed. When report cards came home, mine would sit unopened on the kitchen counter for days while hers got pinned to the refrigerator like some kind of shrine. She'd stand there watching me look at her straight A's, and I could see this satisfaction in her eyes that made my stomach twist. The worst part wasn't even the academic stuff. It was how she'd find these little moments when our parents weren't looking to remind me exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. She'd bump into me in the hallway and whisper about how I was probably adopted because no way we shared the same genes. Or she'd volunteer to help me with homework just so she could sit there sighing dramatically every time I didn't understand something immediately. Our parents ate it up. They'd laugh when she made these cutting remarks about my grades, my friends, my hobbies. They called it sibling rivalry, said it was healthy competition. But there was nothing competitive about it when only one person was allowed to win. I learned to shrink myself down, to take up less space at the dinner table, to keep my voice quiet when I talked about my day because nobody really wanted to hear it anyway. High school was probably the worst period. She was the student council president, debate team captain, had early admission to 3 different colleges by senior year. I was struggling to keep my grades above water and working part-time at a grocery store just to have something that felt like mine. She'd come home from her college prep classes and find me doing homework at the kitchen table, and she'd just shake her head like I was some kind of disappointment she had to witness. The thing that really got to me was how she never had to try. Everything came naturally to her, the grades, the leadership positions, the way adults would light up when she talked to them. Meanwhile, I was grinding just to be average, spending hours on assignments that she could probably finish in 20 minutes. And she made sure I knew it. She'd finish her homework before dinner and then sit there watching me struggle with mine, making these little comments about how maybe I should consider trade school instead of college. When she left for university, I thought things might get better. For about 6 months, they did. The house felt different without her presence sucking up all the oxygen. My parents started noticing me more, asking about my plans, actually listening when I talked. But even then, every phone call from her would shift the energy back. They'd spend an hour catching up with her about her classes, her internships, her social life, and then remember I existed long enough to ask if I'd done my chores. College was my escape. I went to a state school about 4 hours away, nothing prestigious, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I was just another person in the crowd instead of the disappointing younger brother. I made friends who didn't know about my sister's achievements. I joined clubs, got decent grades, even dated a little. It felt like I was finally becoming an actual person instead of just a shadow. But family gatherings were still brutal. She'd come home from her fancy school with stories about internships at major companies, study abroad programs, networking events with successful professionals. I'd talk about my classes or my part-time job, and it felt like showing up to a concert with a kazoo. The conversations would always drift back to her accomplishments, her future plans, her everything. Update 1. After college, things seemed to settle into a routine. She got a job at a consulting firm, moved to a big city, started making the kind of money that impressed our parents at every family dinner. I found work in my field, nothing glamorous but steady, and got my own apartment. We'd see each other at holidays and birthdays, and she'd still make her little comments, but they stung less now that I had my own life. That's when I started noticing the changes. At first, they were subtle. She'd always been intense, but during one Christmas dinner, she went off on this tangent about how the government was monitoring social media posts to build profiles on citizens. Not in a general privacy concern way, but in this specific, detailed way that made everyone at the table uncomfortable. When my dad tried to change the subject, she snapped at him about how he never took anything seriously. The next few months, her social media posts got weird. Long rambling paragraphs about patterns she was seeing in everyday life, connections between random events that didn't make sense to anyone else. She'd call our parents at strange hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, talking rapidly about things that seemed important to her but left them confused and worried. I remember one visit home where she cornered me in the kitchen and started talking about how she'd figured out that certain people in her office were sabotaging her work. She had this whole theory about how they were coordinating with each other, leaving specific items on their desks as signals, timing their bathroom breaks to avoid her. The way she explained it was so detailed and logical within its own framework that for a moment I almost believed her. But then she started talking about the shadows, how they moved differently around certain people, how she could tell who was trustworthy based on the way light fell on their faces. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just stress from her job or relationship problems. This was something else entirely. Our parents were in denial for months. They made excuses about her work being stressful, about how competitive her field was, about how she'd always been high-strung. When she'd call them with her theories and observations, they'd listen politely and then hang up the phone looking worried but not wanting to admit what they were seeing. The breaking point came during a family barbecue that summer. She'd been acting strange all day, jumping at sudden noises, watching people with this intense focus that made everyone uncomfortable. When our neighbor's dog started barking, she became convinced it was some kind of signal. She started pacing around the backyard, muttering about how they'd found her even here, how nowhere was safe anymore. When my mom tried to calm her down, she exploded. Started screaming about how her parents had never protected her, how they'd let strangers into her life, how they were probably part of it too. She grabbed a kitchen knife and waved it around, not threatening anyone specifically, but making it clear that she felt cornered and dangerous. That's when my dad finally called for help. Update 2. The ambulance arrived with police backup, which only made things worse. She saw the uniforms and became convinced that her worst fears were being confirmed. They had to restrain her with a straitjacket because she was fighting so hard, screaming about how they were taking her to be silenced, how no one would believe her now. Watching them carry my sister away while she begged us not to let them take her was one of the most horrifying things I've ever experienced. The next few days were a blur of phone calls with doctors, insurance companies, and legal consultations. The diagnosis came back as schizoaffective disorder, and the psychiatrist explained that the symptoms had probably been building for years before becoming obvious. All those little comments she'd made about people watching her, about patterns and connections, about feeling targeted, they weren't just paranoid thoughts. They were the early stages of a serious mental illness. What hit me hardest was when the doctor mentioned that high-functioning people often hide their symptoms longer. My sister's intelligence, her ability to articulate complex ideas, her natural charisma, all the things that had made her our parents' favorite, had also allowed her to mask her deteriorating mental state until it became impossible to ignore. The family dynamics shifted overnight in ways I never could have anticipated. Suddenly, I was the reliable one, the stable one, the one our parents turned to for decision-making and emotional support. They started asking my opinion on everything from her treatment options to how to handle her apartment lease. After spending 25 years being treated like the family backup plan, I was suddenly the person everyone depended on. But it didn't feel good. It felt hollow and weird and wrong. Their attention wasn't coming from a place of love or recognition of my worth. It was coming from fear and desperation because their first choice was no longer available. They needed someone to fill the role of successful child, and I was the only option left. It was like being promoted because everyone above you got fired, not because you earned it. The visits to the facility were the hardest part. My sister was heavily medicated, and the sharp intelligence that had defined her personality was dulled to a shadow of what it used to be. She'd look at me with these confused eyes, sometimes not recognizing me at first, sometimes remembering exactly who I was but not understanding why I was there. The cruel comments were gone, but so was everything else that had made her who she was. During one visit, she had a moment of clarity and grabbed my hand. She told me she was sorry for how she'd treated me growing up, that she could see now how mean she'd been. But even as she said it, I could tell she was struggling to piece together the memories, like trying to reassemble a puzzle with half the pieces missing. It wasn't really her apologizing, it was the medication talking, or maybe just fragments of guilt floating to the surface of whatever was left of her consciousness. Our parents threw themselves into researching treatment options, support groups, alternative medicine approaches. They became experts on schizoaffective disorder overnight, learning terminology and statistics and prognosis information. But they never acknowledged how they treated me all those years, never recognized that their golden child had been struggling with mental illness while they were too busy praising her achievements to notice the warning signs. Final update. The strangest part of this whole situation has been discovering who I actually am when I'm not constantly being compared to someone else. With my sister in residential care and my parents finally paying attention to me, I've had to figure out what my own personality looks like without the constant pressure to compete or defend myself. It turns out I'm pretty good at handling crisis situations. I'm the one who coordinates with the insurance company, who researches treatment facilities, who drives our parents to family counseling sessions. I'm organized and patient and good at asking the right questions when talking to medical professionals. These aren't skills I knew I had because I'd never been given the chance to use them. My sister's condition has stabilized somewhat over the past year, but she's not the same person. The medication keeps the worst symptoms under control, but it's also flattened everything that made her distinctive. She's docile now, compliant, grateful for visits, but not really engaged with the world around her. Sometimes I catch glimpses of her old self, a flash of her old humor or a moment of sharp observation, but mostly she seems to be watching life from a distance. The hardest part is that I can't separate my feelings about her illness from my feelings about how she treated me. I know I should feel sorry for her, and I do, but I also feel this weird sense of justice that makes me uncomfortable. All those years of being told I was worthless, of being dismissed and ignored and made to feel like a burden, and now she's the one who needs care and supervision. It's not her fault that she's sick, but it's also not my fault that I spent decades being emotionally abused by someone everyone else thought was perfect. Our parents have started making comments about how proud they are of how I've handled everything, how mature and responsible I've become. They talk about me like I'm some kind of late bloomer who finally found my potential. But I was always this person. I was always capable and thoughtful and reliable. They just couldn't see it because they were too busy being dazzled by my sister's performance. The relationship with my parents is complicated now. They need me in ways they never did before, and they're grateful for my help. But there's this underlying tension because we all know this attention is conditional. If my sister recovers, if she becomes functional again, will they go back to treating me like the spare tire? I want to believe they've learned something from this experience, but I also know that people don't usually change their fundamental patterns just because circumstances force them to. I've been going to support groups for families of people with mental illness, and it's been helpful to talk to other people who understand the guilt and confusion and complicated emotions that come with this situation. One thing that keeps coming up is how mental illness affects entire family systems, not just the person who's diagnosed. Everyone has to find new roles and new ways of relating to each other. What I've realized is that I don't want to build my identity around being the stable one, the reliable one, the one who handles everything. That's just another form of being defined by someone else's limitations. I want to figure out who I am and what I want independent of my family's crisis management needs. I've started setting boundaries with my parents about how much I'm willing to coordinate my sister's care. I help when I can, but I'm not going to sacrifice my own life to become their unpaid case manager. I've also been honest with them about how their favoritism affected me growing up. They didn't like hearing it, but it needed to be said. My sister will probably never be the person she was before. The doctors say that with proper medication and support, she can have a meaningful life, but she'll always need some level of care and supervision. She'll never be the high-achieving, sharp-tongued, commanding presence that dominated our family for so many years. In some ways, that's tragic. In other ways, it's freed all of us to become different people. I don't forgive her for how she treated me, but I also don't blame her for being sick. Those are two separate things that I'm learning to hold simultaneously. She was cruel to me long before her symptoms became obvious, but the cruelty might have been connected to the illness in ways none of us understood at the time. It doesn't excuse the behavior, but it provides some context that makes it easier to let go of the anger. The weirdest part is that I actually miss her sometimes. Not the version of her that made my life miserable, but the sharp intelligence and quick wit that made her so formidable. Even when she was being awful to me, there was something impressive about her ability to see through people's defenses and find exactly the right thing to say to get a reaction. That person is gone now, replaced by someone who needs help remembering to take her medication and struggles to follow the plot of television shows. I'm trying to build a life that makes sense regardless of what happens with my family. I'm focusing on my own relationships, my own goals, my own definition of success. It's harder than it sounds because I spent so many years defining myself in opposition to my sister that I'm not sure who I am when she's not there to push against. But I'm figuring it out. I'm learning that being overlooked for 25 years actually taught me some valuable skills. I'm good at observing people, at understanding group dynamics, at finding ways to contribute without needing to be the center of attention. I'm comfortable with quiet achievement and gradual progress. I don't need to be the smartest person in the room or the one everyone notices first. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my sister hadn't gotten sick. Would I have spent my whole life being the forgettable younger brother? Would I have ever developed confidence in my own abilities? Would our parents have ever seen me as more than a consolation prize? I'll never know, but I'm grateful that I finally got the chance to find out who I really am, even if it took a family crisis to make it happen. The attention I get from my parents now isn't the kind I wanted as a kid, but it's taught me something important about conditional love and how family roles can shift in unexpected ways. I accept their gratitude and their newfound respect, but I don't need it to validate my worth. I know who I am now, and that knowledge isn't dependent on anyone else's opinion or approval. It's taken me 30 years to realize that being ignored might have been a gift. While my sister was performing for an audience, I was learning to be myself. While she was winning approval, I was developing actual skills. While she was being praised for her potential, I was quietly becoming someone who could handle whatever life threw at me. I wouldn't choose this path for anyone, but I'm not sorry about where it led me.